Hello, and welcome to Spilling the Tea. This is the podcast where we explore the stories behind the technology that shapes the future of privacy. I'm Lisa Loud from Secret Network, and I'll be one of your co-hosts today. This show is all about the real-world applications of confidential computing and AI, and how they're being used to solve complex problems and protect data, and also unlock new possibilities for individuals and also businesses. So in this show, we don't just talk about the theory, we share the journeys and the challenges and the breakthroughs from builders on the front lines. Today's guest is someone with a fascinating perspective, really excited to have her. Charlene is co-founder and chief revenue officer at Zyphe, the privacy-first decentralized identity verification solution. Charlene brings extensive experience from fintech and payments and real estate, having held executive positions at leading companies in all of these sectors. So prior to Zyphe, Charlene was VP and head of marketing at Qualia, which is the leading real estate closing platform used by millions of consumers every year. Before Qualia, Charlene was VP of Product and Partner Marketing at WorldPay, one of the world's largest merchant acquirers. Charlene was responsible for growing a set of industry-led embedded payment solutions. And she's also held leadership roles at Fin and Coupa Software, leading business spend management company. Charlene is fascinating. She started her career advising Fortune 500 companies at McKinsey & Company and in corporate strategy at EMC and VMware. Charlene holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA from Harvard College. So we're very happy to welcome Charlene. Alongside me today is someone who's been decoding the crypto space for years, Megan Nilsson, also known as Crypto Megan. Megan is a Web3 strategist and speaker and educator with a talent for translating complex blockchain topics into stories that resonate. Welcome, Megan. Glad to have you today.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. And it's so exciting to be on this podcast with Charlene today from Zyphe because speaking of stories that resonate, this is a big story right now, and that's one of identity and how we're going to move forward in a meaningful way, protecting that the data and the sensitive information that's on the internet. And it's really, really important that we get this right. So just to segue right into it, I mean, Charlene, you've chosen quite the endeavor to undertake here in a career transition that's really notable. So what I'd like to start off with to set the tone today is the why. What made you so passionate about solving that identity verification in a privacy-first way, and how did that lead to you founding Zyphe?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. Realizing right now my bio is quite long. So the big thing for me, right, where privacy really matters, I get these data breach notices every other day. I'm sure everyone here does. It's just become a part of life. And it just, you don't even think about it anymore. It's like, oh, okay, sorry, we got your information out on the internet, and, here's a year of some subscription service that monitors your identity. Good luck. And that's it. And that you get this all the time, and people don't even think about it. I am kind of sick of hearing that. And I've had, I, like everyone else, get these spam calls, spam messages. And I just, for me, my privacy is always something that I've cared quite deeply about. And I think that's just something we as human beings have a right to. My background is I've always been launching new technologies, and I've always tried to look for technologies that are kind of on the cusp of really significantly improving the way that businesses and individuals operate. And I was in the fintech space, and I've some of the companies I've been at had some of the leading merchant acquirers, payment platforms, business spend management applications, really, really fast growing companies that are some of the largest in the world. And I just saw that during the onboarding process, you have all this KYC, know your customer, know your business, just all this data that kind of flows through. And I always think about like what is happening with that data. And I also saw that, and on the other hand, Web3 technologies and decentralization was increasingly becoming a thing. And over the last couple of years, we've seen Bitcoin take off. We've seen the crypto industry take off. And we've also seen a lot of the underlying technologies that are coming out of cryptography and those kind of theoretical fields really starting to mature and improve. And that's where I think there's a real opportunity here with our identities, which is something that is so fundamental to us, something that keeps sprawling out into the internet. The decentralization that's happening with things like the Web3 industries, and then there's an opportunity to apply that in a way that really helps us to better protect and secure our own personal information on the internet.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with what you said there, but I can certainly understand why you'd want to tackle such a problem. And it's sort of a scary thing for everyday users when they're putting their information in online and they're not understanding how that's being stored, and they're hearing about breaches and seeing these sort of scary things happening. That this is, for me, a fundamental conversation to be having, and that what we need to be doing forward looking, how we can solve this issue for not only the end user, but also the companies who carry that burden of having to be compliant, but having to somehow store that data in the proper way, and how Zyphe can really help solve that problem. So that's essentially what I want to dig into next. But first, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because we throw around the term self-sovereign identity quite a bit in Web3 because it's something that we're really passionate about. Can you break down just exactly what that means in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very simply, it is the concept of you owning your own identity. And that it goes back to user control. There's a couple of things that go into that. One, decentralization, so that there's nobody else kind of being a middleman and owning your identity on your behalf and representing you. Your information should be verifiable, something that says, this is me, and I can demonstrate that I'm the one who authorized my identity to be shared. Private, where the people who have access to the information are the ones that you've granted access to, but otherwise there shouldn't be other people who really know who you are without your permission. Secure, that kind of goes hand in hand with everything else, but making sure that that information doesn't flow out unnecessarily. And then finally is reusable, because if you use your identity once, you should still be able to represent yourself. If you show up to a store, people see who you are. You can show up again, and it's not like you've changed. So in summary, decentralized, verifiable, private, secure, reusable. And that to me is a self-sovereign identity.
Wow, that's a powerful definition. And I just really quickly then, can you paint the picture of what that map looks like when you're going to sign into something like Google or Facebook versus how you would do that with Zyphe, so that the end user gets sort of a visual or an idea of how that works?
Yeah, sure. So we do want the process to really feel very similar, but what's really happening differently is on the back end. Now, the thing that is probably most exposed to the actual person, who's going through the onboarding, is just how seamless that process is. This is where the reusability really comes into play. If you've gone through that process once, it should be just as easy to go through it again, and in fact easier, because you don't have to go through the onboarding process of actually pulling out your identity or kind of showing, yes, this is who I am. So once you've gone through that process once, in theory, you should it's a passcode, or you like look at your laptop and it verifies your face or something, and then you're through. Now on the back end, that's where all this other stuff comes into place: the decentralization, verifiability, privacy, security, etc. You don't see that per se, but you feel it later on when you're getting those data breach notices or not. So the thing with a lot of those, by default today, when you go through onboarding, there's usually the way it's structured, there's a middleman who kind of holds your information, and they're the ones who kind of say, okay, let me look at your government ID, let me verify that you are who you say you are in that ID. And then there's a bunch of things going on there, processing, and then that data is retained. And then they also have to secure that data, so there's not only is it retained, but there's often backups of that data as well. And then they all have access kind of on their end. Maybe not everyone in their organization, but a bunch of people do. And then on the other hand, the actual organization that you went through the onboarding with also has that information as well. And depending on the regulation and the specific type of onboarding, they also have to retain that as well. And that's oftentimes for periods of 5 to 10 years before they can even delete the data. And the other thing is, oftentimes when data deletion time comes around, that doesn't actually really happen, or it's kind of imperfectly deleted, and then that's when you start hearing about these treasure troves of personal information that eventually get revealed much later, and it creates all these issues. So our way of approaching that is to let's eliminate as many of the middlemen as possible and make sure that we keep the data as secure as we can, and then give that control and reusability back to the users. So what we try to do is we provide the secure infrastructure for that verification to take place, but we ourselves don't actually have access to that data. So we'll issue people with their own decentralized storage vaults that has their own information in there, and then they can kind of grant access. But that's something that they retain, that they have control over, and we're not going to go look up your information in there because we can't. We're not going to go train an AI model on your information so that they can better spam you in the future. Those are things that aren't going to happen. And then on the other hand, the platform that you're onboarding with, say you're trying to sign up with some new crypto exchange, they get access to the information in a very secure and kind of strictly permissioned way that has to do with audit requirements. So they are required by the government to be able to produce some of that information at a later time, but it's the specific permissions that they have around that are very kind of specific to those situations. And then the other thing is they're not retaining that data. And then we're reducing backups as much as possible so that this infrastructure itself is backing up the information, but you don't need additional servers sitting around with your information. And then as you kind of go through this onboarding again, it's not continuing to sprawl your information out across the internet so that you're getting more and more of your personal information sitting around.
Amazing.
Wow. Yeah, that was a great explanation. I know a lot of people are afraid of, where does my data sit online? I really like what you said about, years later it just pops up and people are like, how is this possible? Wasn't this supposed to be deleted? Didn't I delete this? So there's a lack of trust on the user end, and also a burden of having to store that somehow on the company side or on the, the other side of things. So I think you painted the picture properly for what the problem is, what we're sort of tiptoeing around, and you're tackling that head on. And now I'd like to pass the mic to my co-host Lisa, who is going to ask you a little bit more technical questions about the back end of that process.
Yeah, this is fascinating because Secret Network is doing something similar with privacy preserving smart contracts. So at Secret, we're enabling decentralized applications that have both public and private data in them. So I don't know how familiar you are with Secret's architecture, but I'm wondering if you can address how you see Zyphe's identity verification fitting into Secret's privacy infrastructure.
Yeah. So the infrastructure, and I haven't dug into all the the documentation around that, but a lot of times with smart contracts, you're trying to get some kind of specific action done. So there's a secure computation going on. There's some kind of user-driven activity. I want to be able to do X. And that's something that's very important to secure. Even the act of saying, I want to share my credentials with so-and-so, those are all kind of activities. The thing that a lot of protocols don't have today is an actual way to retain the personal information, because at the end of the day, you do have to show, there has to be some process at the beginning of all this that says, I've demonstrated who I am who I say I am. And then that information always needs to sit somewhere. And so that's where we have these personal information vaults. And again, it's built on a decentralized infrastructure. So not to bore anyone, but basically the information we split out into shards, and then that's sent out randomly to tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of nodes. And then each shard kind of is able to back up other shards, but without a certain number, you can't actually access any of the information. And then the thing is that random configuration of shards is going to be different for each identity. So it's a very secure infrastructure, and that's what we believe needs to happen for you to actually retain your information. So at some point you have a passport or some kind of government ID that says, I am this person, and that information needs to be put somewhere. So we supply those storage vaults, and then we can work with a lot of different layers in terms of how we actually want to share out specific information, depending on what the user opts to use.
Yeah. So I understand you're doing essentially multi-party compute. You're sharding the information and storing it separately. Is there any kind of encryption on the information
Oh,
that's
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, we're taking the latest protocols or the latest security protocols when it comes to encryption, and we're also thinking about the post-quantum world as well. So we're not just taking today's encryption standards, but we're actually, the thing that people say is store now, decrypt later for quantum computing. So no, it's not going to be sitting there in a way that anyone can really easily decode.
right? What kind of encryption are you using? I understand you're using the latest standards. Do you have any specifics on the standards that you're using, or do you know if you're using fully homomorphic encryption?
So in terms of how we approach everything, we're using a trusted execution environment. So we do the calculations in a TE, and then, but the thing is, all that information is really quickly deleted afterwards, and that's for efficiency purposes. But also, we find that that's where data breaches happen isn't at the point where those calculations are actually being made, and those environments tend to be very secure. What happens is afterwards, when the credentials must be retained for 5 to 10 years, and depending on the regulatory environment, we issue that into the decentralized storage vaults that are highly secured, and then that is something that can be reconstructed later at a specific time based on audit requirements.
That's super interesting. I didn't know that most data breaches don't happen as part of the data collection. It sounds like it's more if a company has held on to that data for a number of years, then that's where the data breaches are happening. Is that correct?
Yes, by and large, I mean almost all I mean actually I don't actually know of a single data breach that has happened on the actual point of data collection.
Right.
All the breaches happen, by and large, a good example is the Coinbase breach. Afterwards, that's the data retention part,
Yeah.
right? Where there's a bunch of user records being retained somewhere, usually, and it's all right now. The default is in a centralized database, and in fact, nobody actually thinks about that retention process, which is kind of scary. But it sits in a centralized database, and then a bunch of people are given access. For a lot of different purposes. And in the case of Coinbase, what happened was, I think it was actually probably one of their outsourced support agents. So companies have BPOs, business process outsourcing partners, and then those guys are actually able to help with things like support tickets. Now, the thing that's scary about that is they have access to all that source information. They have multiple records that they can, and then in this case, somebody was actually bribed, and they were able to download a bunch of different credentials all at once. So that's where by and large, where those data breaches happen is in circumstances like that.
So I have intimate knowledge of the Coinbase breach because I was affected by it, and I've also
I'm sorry.
yeah, it's been kind of rough that so many like at least twice a day I get attempted attacks. Still, and sometimes they'll say that they're from Coinbase, sometimes they'll say they're from Kraken or KuCoin or Binance or anything. They're very creative. But I also helped a Cointelegraph editor, Yatsui, to write an article about the Coinbase breach. The interesting thing about that article is that the journalist's main point was that he didn't think companies like exchanges should collect KYC. But with this additional context, I would give different feedback now, understanding that collection point is not really the point of vulnerability, it's more the retention. Super interesting. So that's one misconception that I had about the Coinbase data breach. What are some other misconceptions people have about privacy in identity verification? Are people worried about the wrong things, kind of like that, when it comes to their personal data?
Yeah, I think when it comes to your personal data, there's a couple of areas where you could lose that information. The most common ones, like I said, one of them is upon retention, and that is again, because this is where the treasure trove of your information sits for many, many, many years. There's actually another point which people always talk about is if you're obviously phishing attempts. So if somebody asks you to log into a website, that's where a lot of the information is lost upon the actual collection, is when you end up on a not Coinbase or like Coinbase.xyz, which is in Coinbase or something, and then you end up giving your information and it's like, oh, okay, now they have it. I can also transition a little bit and just kind of talk a little bit about what KYC actually is, because I think it's a bit of a misconception of like why do we have to go through this process to begin with, right? KYC, know your customer, know your business, exists to secure the broader financial system, because one of the issues that happens is financial crime. So a lot of times people are using different types of applications, and the more and actually in a weird way, the more that you're able to kind of keep information out of the hands of the authorities, the more kind of people go to those particular types of financial institutions just to kind of do money laundering or to, do kind of finance illicit activities. So the point of a KYC is to make sure that you don't have, somebody who's financing terrorism or who's kind of trafficking things that shouldn't be trafficked, going through a platform and using that platform to kind of finance those things. So with the KYC, the biggest thing I think is it's sort of a necessary evil in a way. I mean, people have different philosophical perspectives on what you should be allowed to use money for, but as of today, it's a requirement to help prevent financing illicit activities. And now the thing about it, where KYC is a necessary evil, I think at the very least, if it's just checking your name against an anti-money laundering list or a sanctions list, that's something that I think you could argue is a legitimate use case for that. The issue is more so kind of that information leaking out along the way, so that it's almost like it should be more of a direct line. If it has to happen, it should be more of a direct line between you, the institution, and the government, and not so much you, the institution, different people within those institutions, the middleman that helps to do all this, the data retention people, the servers that are managing the data, and then those are the points where kind of it's almost like you have this like private line between you and the government, and then information is kind of leaking out. Yeah. And so that's what we're trying to solve, is that leakage part.
That's really interesting. So you're trying to make that private line, that direct connection between you and maybe one entity or maybe two entities, and then everyone else has to trust those entities that you are who you say you are, rather than sharing it, like basically broadcasting, kind of shotgun approach. You're broadcasting your private information to everybody who might possibly ever need it.
Right, exactly. Or who might not need it.
Specifically. Might need it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And also, Lisa, how you were saying that you were writing an article about the Coinbase breach with Yatsu, who's also a friend and has been on the podcast quite a bit. And I know that, Animoca is very concerned with identity and identity solutions on chain, and that, the way that our data is handled and identity are at the forefront of this whole revolution, as well as privacy preserving things, TEEs, what Secret Network is doing. So this is all part of the core atomic building blocks of this next financial layer of the internet, right? And the next layer of the internet in general is how do we preserve this data? I know so many breaches. It makes sense to me what you said, that those breaches often occur in the storage of the data. And a lot of times, like with SIM swaps, or with what you said, that the middlemen are bribed. It's this sort of middleman in between that facilitates that a lot of times. And that's understandable. I wanted to ask you, with your recent round of funding, where you see the intersection of privacy preserving identity and blockchain infrastructure heading in the next 2 to 3 years. So will there be a different tech? Will you explore different solutions? Where do you see this going in the next couple of years?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think the first thing we want to do, which is not a technical thing, is just kind of drive more awareness of what's really happening when you go through the onboarding process. Because like I said, what's surfaced to the user isn't how secure your your onboarding is. You see how quick it is. And most people actually, for most people, they think the quicker the better, because obviously, like, you don't want to go through a lot of friction during onboarding. And we do try to optimize that as much as we can. We try to make things as seamless as possible and as automated, and have technology take on as much of the heavy work as possible. But one thing I do think people should think about a lot more is not just how quickly you're able to go through the onboarding, but whether that onboarding is actually secure and whether you're going to have that data breach notice later on. Now, moving more over to the technology side, I think right now we're in an environment where you have to show your source data, where for the sake of compliance, for KYC, you have to actually show, or at least the platform, if asked by the regulators, needs to be able to produce your actual ID and your information, and the proof that they actually did all the right checks. And that's so. And unfortunately, bad things do happen sometimes, and regulators come back and check and say, well, where did things break down? And so they have to be able to get all that information out. I'm hoping we can move to more of an environment in collaboration with regulators, where we can more and more kind of secure and keep aspects of that information private as much as we can. And in an ideal world, we should be able to use ZK, zero knowledge proofs, for a lot of different things. The issue with ZK proofs is that they're not fully accepted by regulators, and it would have to be something that we've co-developed in a way where there's confidence on each side that this is actually doing what the government needs, while also protecting identity. So I think for us to move into environments where we're doing ZK, we're doing more FHE type of encryption, we'd have to collaborate further with regulators and kind of bring them into the fold and reassure them that we are being thoughtful as an industry in terms of, on the one hand, how do we balance privacy, but then how do we also balance the stability and the legality of the overall financial system, right? Because I think, at least for me personally, I don't want to finance terrorism. Like, that's just something I personally don't, I'm not a big fan of. But I also think about, like, how do you do that in a way that also kind of balances privacy and security requirements? So I think we need to bring more regulators into the fold and explain to them how these technologies work, and then get their confidence that this is how we actually, do this, that we're doing it the right way. The other thing I really think is going to be, I'm very excited about personally, is more interoperability and more ability to use your own personal credentials, secure credentials across the board. And I'm thinking not just, the know your customer process and the onboarding process, but, something like, and I'm not going to pick on LinkedIn here, but I will pick on LinkedIn a little bit, but, your employment history and your employment, both what you reveal publicly and privately. When you onboard with new companies, they do a background check on you. Well, how do you make sure that information is also being secure? And how do you make sure that that's actually tied to you and accurate? So there's a lot more use cases beyond just kind of, the simple, like, you are who you say you are.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there, right? It's really interesting going through this identity, how it's processed, how it's evolved, and where we need to head in order for it to be, handled the proper way. And I think you're absolutely right about involving the regulators and explaining these new technologies, because, it's all a new world. It's a completely new way of doing things. Lisa, I'll let you take the mic for the next question here.
I don't think any of us are fans of terrorism or human trafficking, and it's just, sometimes it's challenging to maintain, we're so focused, the regulators are so focused on preventing bad activity that sometimes they infringe on our rights as people who have private information and don't necessarily want to share it with everybody. And that's always that, I think you've addressed that challenge, the balance between protecting our privacy and making sure the world is not subject to bad actors. But I just want to dive in. Is there another technical challenge? We've talked a little about encryption. We've talked about adoption challenges. Are there any other technical challenges that you faced in building a truly decentralized identity solution, and how are you tackling that?
Yeah, well, there's always a ton of technical challenges because there, on the one hand, for instance, always a balance for us is like, how do you check public data sources? How do you check private information against public data sources? And like, how do you kind of secure that whole process? And where do you make the reality is there's always trade-offs with every single thing that you're doing. So a good example of a trade-off is friction versus security. So when you go through onboarding, you can make something infinitely secure. And we've had actually prospects and companies come to us and say, I want a foolproof process that there are no frauds. And I say, okay, well, the best way to ensure that is to shut down your platform.
There you go, 100%.
Yeah, and so, but I'm like, do you want any users as well? So for that's a really good challenge, and we always think about like the balance between different things.
Right.
So the easier you make onboarding, the easier it is for somebody who is maybe not doing it for legitimate reasons to get onboarded. But the harder you make it, the more secure your platform will be. But on the other hand, you won't have any users.
Right.
So there's a couple of areas we're always trying to kind of get to strike that fine balance.
So just to shift the focus again, for developers and entrepreneurs who are listening to this, who may want to build privacy-first applications, what advice would you give them in a minute or less about how to integrate self-sovereign identity? And then we'll move to, after that, Megan can wrap us up.
Yeah, for sure. So we're always looking to partner with different platforms and ecosystems who are onboarding. And that, for us, the integration is something like, it usually takes about 15 minutes, or actually less than 15 minutes. Very easy to kind of get this onto your platform. If you're trying to build really exciting applications and think about these thorny topics of, privacy and security versus user experience, we are also hiring, so you are always looking for people to partner with us. But we generally try to play nice with a bunch of different companies. I think one thing I will also call out is that even Web3 companies right now are, there's always a temptation to take the easy path too. So it's hard for companies to make changes. So it's even as simple as like integrating a something that takes 15 minutes. People are always trying to find that time to kind of do something like that and put the right kind of controls in place on their platform. So I say, make sure that as you're actually building, that you're thinking about not just your core platform. And some people build these virtual fortresses, but then when it comes to their actual onboarding, it's like, well, here's your information, let's put it everywhere. So I would just encourage people to really think about that.
Right, to have it as a forefront thought rather than after the fact, right? Yes. I know we talk a lot about that in this podcast as well. So, Charlene, it's been really great unpacking this self-sovereign identity concept with you, what that means, how we can get it right, and just what the future looks like, which is incredibly bright as we start to transition into this era where we do take data and self-sovereign identity seriously, and we get things right this time. Right. So how can people get involved? Those who are listening, how can they get involved with what Zyphe is building?
Yeah, I mean, our website hopefully is pretty easy to find. Zyphe, zyphe.com. Come reach out to us. We're on X. We're on LinkedIn. We're on a bunch of different platforms. So just come find us.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and hope to catch up with you soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Charlene.